Right, the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to put a box around all the verbs. So we've got identify, we've got recognize, we've got explain, we've got another recognize, another identify, and also illustrate. And finally, an understand. So these verbs tell me not only what the content is, but they tell me what I've got to do with the content. So let's look at the first paragraph here. It says, identify the components of DNA. We know that that bit means, right, what is the structure of DNA? And that we have covered in Unit 4, which was when we did the cell cycle. And if you need to double check, if you go and you look on this page, here we've got the structure of DNA. We've got the double-sided. We've got a nucleotide here made up of a phosphate, the sugar, and a nitrogen base. And we know there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different nitrogen bases. And the nitrogen bases are held together with hydrogen bonds. And it also shows that we've got complementary base pairing. So adenine goes with thymine and guanine always goes with cytosine. Okay? And so that we've already kind of covered that bit, so we're not going to go back and do that in detail, but you should have this in your notebook. So the next part of this paragraph here says, and this is kind of key here, identify how information for specifying traits is carried on DNA. I am going to really simplify that whole thing, because what that whole section there means is really this question: what is the genetic code? We use this phrase all the time. We talk about, oh, DNA is your genetic code. What we're going to do in this unit is actually look at what is our genetic code. What is it in the DNA that specifically codes for these traits or characteristics of an organism? All right, this next one here is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have. The actual objective says, recognize that the components that make up the genetic code are common to all organisms. Okay, I want you to think carefully about this. I'm going to tell you what it does not mean. This does not mean, okay? And I want you to put like an asterisk by the side of that. What it does not mean, it does not mean that, okay, all organisms have the same sequence of DNA. It does not mean that, okay? We get stuck with this idea that if everything's got the same DNA, well, think about it. If the order of the ATGCs in everybody's DNA and every living thing's organism was the same, if we had exactly the same sequence of nitrogen bases, ATGCs, as a cat or a turtle or, you know, an oak tree, then what would happen is we'd all be exactly the same. And that's clearly not the case. What this section here is saying really is this, right? What it's actually saying is all organisms have DNA, right? So we all have a double helix. We all have the bases, the nitrogen bases A, T, G, and C. Okay? So we all have A, T, G, and C. Those bits are the same. The structure of our DNA, it doesn't matter whether you are a pine tree, whether you are a gerbil, or you are a snail, or you are a human. Your DNA in every organism has the same structure. DNA in every organism has the same nitrogen bases making up its code. What is different, right, is that, let's move this down a bit, every organism has a unique sequence of nitrogen bases, right? So even though we all have ATGC, we all have a unique sequence of the nitrogen bases, have a unique sequence, okay, of bases. And that is a very important distinction to make, that while we have the identical DNA in terms of structure and components, the order of those nitrogen bases in every different type of living organism is unique. Okay, so additionally, right, if we look at the next section, it says explain the purpose and the process of transcription and translation using models of DNA, which we know about, and RNA, and that's going to be new to us. But what does that whole bit really mean? It means this. How do we go, right? How, that's the process, and why, that is the purpose, right? How do we go from our DNA code to making proteins? And I can't stress this enough. Proteins are what make you you. Okay, proteins are basically our characteristics. What is our DNA? We talk about the genetic code, right? The sequence of the ATGCs. What that sequence actually codes for is specific proteins. And if you haven't learned anything about proteins yet, which I know you already have, you should also always remember that there are thousands of different proteins, and every protein has a particular job. And so the shape and the structure of the protein have to perfectly suit its job, or it can't do its job very well. And in the video that we watched, we know that there's structural proteins like your hair and your skin, and then there's functional proteins like hormones and antibodies and all the things that do stuff in our bodies. All right, so proteins are everything that make you the way you are. Now, the other thing here, it says, and when we get to RNA, that's a big thing that we're kind of like some new knowledge we're going to have to use, since we already know so much about DNA. The next thing it says is recognize that gene expression is a regulated process. I am going to put one word there, because we know by now that if we see that something is regulated, what it means is it is controlled. So gene expression, which is basically making proteins, is a very controlled process. Okay, moving on. Identify and illustrate changes in DNA and evaluate the significances of these changes. Okay, this whole thing is talking, I'm going to move this down here because this is kind of like a side topic, mutations. Okay, mutations are when the order of DNA changes. So a mutation is nothing more than a change in DNA. And since the most important thing in DNA is the ATGCs, if we change the sequence of ATGCs, we've changed the DNA. If we change the DNA, we have a mutation. And it says identify and illustrate, and then DNA changes in DNA, and evaluate the significance. There's another verb there. Basically, what evaluate means is if I have this mutation, if I have this change, what happens? Okay, what happens if I change the order of nitrogen bases? Okay, and most of the time, we always think of mutations as a bad thing. A lot of the time, your DNA can change and nothing happens, right? And you will understand when we go back to how we control the process of protein synthesis, why nothing happens. But sometimes you can change, you can have a mutation, you can change the order of DNA, and if that gives you a characteristic that makes you better able to survive, then guess what? That's a good thing, isn't it? And if you survive, you can probably pass that mutation on to your offspring. So they will also have that mutation. And so you will have, an organism that is better suited to where it lives. It's more adapted. It can more likely to survive. And if you survive, you reproduce. And so we can end up, that's how we end up with so much diversity in different living organisms because of mutations, because mutations led to new species of organisms being able to survive better in their environment. Now the last bit, this is kind of a new bit that I've put in here. It does kind of tie in with a lot of our other objectives, but it's understand how the COVID-19 virus relates to protein synthesis and our immune response. The one thing we have heard a lot about lately is, vaccines, okay? And we've heard about the mRNA vaccine that we are now using to help people stop getting infected with COVID-19. And the interesting thing is the way this vaccine works, the new ones. Now, there are a bunch of different vaccines, but the two which we currently have available to us, the one that's produced by Pfizer and the one that's produced by Moderna, they have a direct relationship to how proteins are made. So this is kind of an overview of what we're going to do in the whole of this unit. It's a lot of material, but the secret here is not to complicate it. So if you find like you're getting like bogged down in detail, take a step back and we will kind of go back to scratch. It's a very simple process with some steps that we have to learn and a bunch of new vocab, of course, but it's not difficult. If you did the cell cycle and mitosis, if you got them, which based on your test scores, most of you did, this is going to be a piece of cake too. So this is Unit 5. This is our objective breakdown.